Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book about the intersecting lives of two leaders, Dwight Eisenhower and Winston Churchill, who bore great responsibility in and received great credit for the Allied victory in what is often called America's last good war, World War II. The book is entitled Eisenhower and Churchill, the Partnership That Saved the World. Its author is Professor James C. Humes, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jim, thank you very, very much for coming to us from Southern Colorado, where you are teaching. Jim, tell me, why did you write a book that deals jointly with the intersecting lives of these two men, their relationships, their differences, their similarities?
Well, some books had been written, Larry, about Roosevelt and Churchill, but none about Eisenhower and Churchill. And these are two dominating personalities, heroic personalities of the last century. And I think it's important for readers and future readers to understand the relationship of these two great men and their values and how it shaped history.
You think, do you not, that these were two of the greatest, maybe the two greatest men of the 20th century? Churchill himself is often said to be the greatest man of the 20th century. Why do you think they were so great? And you also say that although they were two of the greatest men of the 20th century, their values were firmly rooted in the 19th century. Explain also what you mean by that.
Well, their values were, in the 19th century, honor, duty, responsibility. Almost like the words gallantry, they don't have the resonance that they used to have.
No, these are long gone concepts.
That's right. They both, by 21st century standards, would be considered sexist in a way. Eisenhower liked women to have their lipstick on. He didn't like women in the White House in front of him in pants. Churchill really didn't put a woman in his cabinet. So by the standards, if we want to use that of 21st century standards, that's considered sexist. They are giants. Eisenhower himself thought Churchill was the greatest man of the last century. So do people like Colin Powell, John Kennedy, and various others. Eisenhower ranks up there. Certainly the first tier is Churchill. Then you get to the second tier, and you're comparing other people, such as Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and others. And I would rank Eisenhower over Roosevelt. He led an incredible army. The logistical feat of crossing Normandy is one of the greatest military feats in history, so Churchill himself said. His presidency is underestimated. He ended the war in Korea. No people were killed while he was president. He balanced the budget 4 out of 6 times. Inflation stayed, hamburgers at 20 cents, hot dogs at 15 cents for 8 years. The first civil rights bill was passed, and at that period will be regarded as the time when America's prestige was never higher in the world, and Eisenhower takes a lot of credit for it because of the figure he projected.
Everybody, I think, is willing at this point in time to say that Winston, if I remember correctly, it's Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill,
yes,
was the greatest, or one of the greatest men of the 20th century. But Eisenhower has been undergoing a kind of a reevaluation, hasn't he? Because when I was a kid, he was regarded as sort of an inarticulate stumblebum, and that analysis has really dramatically, or that assessment has really dramatically changed.
Yes, it has. He deserves some of the blame for that. He had a way of being deliberately obtuse in his answers to questions. When people say, "Are you going to use nuclear weapons in the field?" he would deliver an answer that would make Casey Stengel seem lucid. Subject couldn't find the predicate in 1,000 years. But he was dumb like a fox, you see. And so he he had this way, which Fred Greenstein of Princeton writes, of how he would put lightning rods next to him. Nixon as vice president, Dulles as secretary of state, Ezra Taft Benson as secretary of agriculture, and they would get the flack while he stayed back, and everyone said, oh, well, poor nice Ike, he doesn't realize what these people were saying. Well, he knew what they were saying, and they did it on his command.
Yeah. You know, there was always that famous comment when he was asked whether he could think of anything, any contribution that Nixon had made to the last 8 years of the Eisenhower presidency, and I think he says, well, give me a few minutes and I can think of one, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, actually, the relationship with Nixon was complex. He did not like politicians, period. That is, professional politicians. But he was for Nixon over any other professional politician. There was a different age gap between them. I remember one of the things he said just before he died, and he said he didn't think Nixon would win the second term. He said, Dick has the qualifications in foreign policy better than any other person who's ever served in the presidency, maybe perhaps one. He meant himself. But I'm not sure he has the personality to win the second term, but he said he's brilliant. Now, this was what he said. So the relations there were complex. He deliberately gave Nixon a role, the modern role as vice president, that he was to be his deputy chief of state, going around all of these countries, and the head of the political party, which he didn't want to be, and for him to make the tough statements against Democrats.
Now, I think people should know, and maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit for us. You actually have known the Churchill family, have been personal friends with the Eisenhower family, were an aide to Eisenhower, and have been acquainted and spoken to and before everybody from Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter right back to Eisenhower and Churchill. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the relationships you had with Churchill, with his sons and daughters, and with the Eisenhower family, starting with Eisenhower himself and coming down through the generations?
Well, I met Churchill in May 29th, 1953. It's mentioned in Sir Martin Gilbert's book. I shook hands with him. He said, young man, study history. Study history. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft. I went back to my room, tore down the picture of Ted Williams and put up Winston Churchill. People say, well, gosh, you've met other presidents, you've written, and you can say for 5 U.S. presidents. I said, no, it wasn't. When I met Churchill, it was like meeting Napoleon, Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great. With this exception, I agreed with the values of Churchill and not with those dictators. But Churchill was like shaking hands with history. Now, Eisenhower...
Can I interject something here?
Yes.
You do a wonderful imitation of Churchill, and I'm sure you will do it periodically, but the suit that you are wearing is a Churchillian suit. He was famous for that blue pinstripe suit.
That's right, that's right. Now, Eisenhower, his persona was much different than the real Eisenhower. Eisenhower, if the cameras were on him, he could flick a magic button and be Huck Finn as painted by Norman Rockwell. And he had a glow on his face, so he had that pink ruddiness and bald head that it would light up a dark room like a light bulb. But when the cameras were away, he was a 5-star general, you were a private, and you knew the difference. I mean, he was a tough commander-in-chief.
Do you think that, I don't know how to put this, was there any falseness then in the persona that he presented to the public?
No, I don't think so. It was just that he believed in running a tight ship of state. He would get a tough SOB as his chief of staff, which Adams was, and he believed in that was the way to do it. He had served that role when he had been with MacArthur. And he believed that was the way it had to be done. He was, yes, with his family and with women present. he had this tremendous charm which he could unleash.
Yeah, you've talked to me about having an actual glow that seemed to emanate.
Yes. A glow. Well, it was from that ruddy face and bald head. He had a glow. I mean, you could always almost imagine in those medieval pictures of saints where they had the halo. I mean, he had a glow around his head. I don't mean that he was a saint, but that he had a charisma that emanated from this glow.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in the book, and of course, you after that, in addition to knowing Eisenhower, and you were actually an aide to Eisenhower?
Well, I worked part-time when I was in law school in Washington and did some remarks for him, and I met him on many occasions, and my wife worked full-time for him. So we got to meet him at office parties and things like that.
I see, I see. In the book, you talk a lot about the differences and similarities and circumstances and characteristics and the nature of the two men. Let's start with, say, the circumstances of their birth and their attitudes towards their fathers and who their fathers were and what they got from their mothers. Can you compare that? Would you compare that for us?
Of course, Churchill was born in the Palace Blenheim, but you know, he was really the prototype of a poor little rich boy. Was packed off to boarding school when he was 5, not even picked up for Christmas holidays, only really had 5 conversations with his father.
Very sad, actually.
Very sad. And yes, the family wasn't poor, of course, but they went around with a circle, the jet set of their time, where they were, didn't have the money to keep up with them. Now, Eisenhower grew up in a Norman Rockwell setting. He was poor, but he didn't know he was poor. And he had an idyllic life of, if you can imagine, Abilene just before the turn of the century. But they both had stern fathers, and yet both men adored their fathers. People don't know that Camp David was actually named after his father, David Eisenhower, and not his grandson. That's what David himself told me.
The grandson,
yes. The father, that is David Eisenhower, invested his money to have a store, and he sold out his stake in the farm. And the farm went, the store in Hope, Kansas went bankrupt. And he was embittered because of it. And his father was an embittered man. He lashed the boys hard. In fact, he once was arrested for beating up a kid. He was a tough person. Now, Winston's father, Lord Randolph, was a genius in a way, but a meteor. He flashed in the sky and crashed to the ground. He became the youngest Chancellor of the Exchequer in history. He was brilliant. Churchill worked hard on his speeches. They came from Randolph like that. And he was brilliant, just off the top of his head. And it's interesting that both men revered their fathers. Of course, Churchill's mother, Jenny, she really only became interested in him when Winston could be an instrument for her own social success, in a sense. Where Ida, who was Eisenhower's mother, everything was for her son's advancement, and she took great pride in her sons. She had that big, wide smile that she inherited from Ike. She was not a pretty woman, but I've had some people tell me, whom I talked with, that she could, when she engaged them in conversation, was so interesting. She said her face was just bright, was so bright and radiant that she became pretty at that moment.
So very much like you're describing the glow about Eisenhower himself.
Yes, and of course the person who really became Churchill's mother was his nanny. Mrs. Everest, he called her Woman for Woman, and when you go to his house in Chartwell, the picture by his bed is that of his nanny. Now, to say something of his courage, now this is important about Churchill's courage. At Harrow, and I went to an English boys' school, they all had nannies, and they didn't like to be reminded of it. But he paid for his nanny to come to Harrow to see him, and took her hand and walked across the quadrangle with everyone hissing at him. The boys, he said, oh, Winston, you don't want to do that. Winston, they're making fun of you. And he was, I'm proud to do this with you. And he was the one who paid, with his little money, flowers to be at her grave when she died. And he went there to her service. But the fact that he would invite her up and walk in front of all these 17-year-olds holding her hand, it showed a courage.
Yeah, yeah. He was a man who showed indomitable courage and the courage of his convictions,
Yes.
which is one of the most rare types of courage, perhaps.
Yes.
Both of them, it's well known that Churchill was a great writer, although he composed his writings by oratory. But what is not so well known, perhaps, is that Eisenhower, too, was a fine writer.
Eisenhower got to the top, interestingly, by his writing. First of all, when he was in Texas, and he hoped to be sent with General Pershing and to Mexico, and he wasn't. He became, in a sense, a chief of staff to a colonel running a post, and he hated paperwork. So he was a master at paperwork. But then later on, he did such a good job about writing about the World War I battlefields and memorials in France that Pershing, he came to Pershing's attention, and Pershing said, look, you go back to France for a year and write another book and look at the battlefields firsthand. And Pershing asked him to look over his memoirs of World War I. And Eisenhower told him he should write it in chronological form, not diary form. Both men were right. Pershing did get a Pulitzer Prize, but it bombed as a book.
Right.
But yes, he wrote A Crusade for Europe by himself. Now,
no ghostwriters.
Yeah, and people say, well, you know, he wasn't a great speaker. True, but when he wrote the speeches himself, he was great. He wrote his own speech at the Guildhall, and Churchill said it was one of the greatest speeches he ever heard in his life.
Which speech was that, after the war?
Right after the war. He was given the freedom of London at Guildhall in 1945 in July, and I guess it was in June. And Churchill said it was one of the finest speeches. He said he would rank it with the Gettysburg Address. It was a magnificent speech on freedom. He wrote his eulogy for Churchill, and you know, Johnson did not send him on the delegation to go there to the funeral, but he said, delegation, no delegation, I'm going to say goodbye to my friend. But he opens up and he said, on the mighty Thames, that great avenue of history, now bears the barge with the last mortal remains of Sir Winston Churchill. He was a maker of history. But I can hear him now say with the poet, sunset and evening star in one clear call for me, and may there be no moaning of the bar when I set out to sea. Well, I could give the whole, but it was a beautiful speech. He wrote it himself.
You know, you have one of those remarkably flexible faces. When you imitate Eisenhower, you look like Eisenhower. And in your book, somebody looks at you and looks at the picture of Churchill in your book. There's a certain resemblance to Churchill as well. Maybe it's just that all people with brown faces look like that.
I don't know.
But they do.
But so he did have. Thank you. He did have. When he spoke himself, and one of the things he asked why his letters that Eisenhower had were so boring and bureaucratic when he was in the White House, and someone came and said, look, you know, they don't sound like you. He said, look, I made up my mind. I've only so much time as president, and I delegate that out, and I sign it. I know they're boring, and I knew I wouldn't write them that way.
You know, I first began to think that the general idea about Eisenhower was wrong when I saw a television program in 1964 where he toured the Normandy battlefields, the beaches, with Walter Cronkite, and his command of the language, his command of the facts and everything was most impressive, and began to get the idea, well, hey, maybe this idea of an inarticulate stumblebum is not right. Why did Eisenhower, why wasn't he a better speaker? Did he not care? Did he think it was too hammy? What was his...
The difference is, you know, Roosevelt, MacArthur, and Churchill all descended from a New England ancestor, interestingly. And I like to think...
They had a common ancestor.
Yes, a common
very
ancestor.
little-known fact.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that there's one common gene that came down,
Yeah.
H-A-M, ham.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower was sort of like, I remember with George Bush. George Bush said all speeches that his senior were BS and bragging. And Eisenhower had a bit of this in him. He just resisted. And mind you, he served under MacArthur and wrote MacArthur's speeches in the Philippines.
And he was a great speaker.
Yes, and he just saw, you know, what he said about MacArthur. I remember he was saying to a group here, well, you know, he said, Mac had an eye problem. You know, people with glaucoma, detached retina. He had a fatal addiction to the perpendicular pronoun, I.
Yeah, right.
And he saw in that ham, that kind of practicing speeches. And someone came to him and said, you know, you should pause or do this. And he said, and actually it was Tom Dewey in the 52 campaign, who fancied himself as a great orator. And he made this. And boy, he just turned to score on him and said, look, I studied under the Manila School of Dramatic Arts. Don't tell me.
Right. We have to take a break and go to a couple of public service announcements. But when we come back, maybe you could tell the people a little bit about, I want to skip a little bit now and talk about some of the things that they agreed on and disagreed on in World War II and some of the famous things that Churchill said in World War II. So we'll continue with that as soon as we come back from the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Jim, they went through so much together,
yes,
from 1941 through 1945, and then again in the early 1950s. That when Winston Churchill lay dying, Eisenhower visited him. Tell about that.
Well, he went over for the 20th anniversary of D-Day, and he stops in London, 28 Hyde Park Gate, and Lady Churchill tells him that Winston had a stroke. He's in King Edward's Hospital. Now he comes into the room, and there is Churchill propped up against the bed, his face flaccid with 9 decades of infirmities. He cannot speak. He's paralyzed. But he has his hand, and he takes it over, this pink cherubic hand, and clasps Eisenhower's. No word spoken. 4 minutes pass. 2 old men sharing silently the battles they together fought for the ideals they mutually cherished. 7 minutes pass, no word spoken. 2 old men holding hands. Now, I've written 30 books, but no one, save Churchill himself, could have written words more poignant, more eloquent than that mute hand clasp between 2 nations, 2 leaders, and 2 friends. And then 9 minutes pass. And Churchill unclasped the hand and gently waves.
Right. There was a...
And Eisenhower withdraws, and he says to Anthony Montague Brown, who was Churchill's aide who had come, he said, I just said goodbye to Winston. But you know, you never say farewell to courage.
9 minutes just holding hands. What a remarkable scene. All of this really started, now both of them, we'll save it for later, but both of them really had a bad time in the 1920s and 1930s for various reasons and began to come into their own starting around 1939, 1940. Tell what happened, how Churchill first came back into the cabinet and that great cable went out and the reason behind it that said Winston is back, how he came back into the cabinet and how that he then became the prime minister, what was said by others and by him.
Well, when Britain went to war in 1939, after the invasion of Poland, Chamberlain's government was tottering, and he brought in its greatest critic, Churchill, to be First Lord of the Admiralty again. And he goes back into the Admiralty, and the maps were still as he left them in World War I. And it's piped around the Navy, Winston is back.
Yeah.
And yes, he, and then of course
That's what
he
they
would
thought
become,
of him.
oh my, yes, every sailor, I mean, flashing on every ship in Singapore, Malaysia, Winston is back.
Yeah.
And then of course that was 39, and he became prime minister in May.
And when he became prime minister, because a fellow named, well, not because, but when he became prime minister, just before, a fellow named Amory, I think quoting from
Hampden,
Cromwell.
I think, you have sat too long. In the name of God, go!
Right.
And they quoted that, Hampden in the Long Parliament, and that was the message to Chamberlain to resign. And Lloyd George, the old prime minister, came up and gave a great speech that he had to go. He said, the greatest contribution you can do your country is to lay down your seals of office.
And this was the man who had seen Britain at the end in 1917 and 1918 through to victory
and
in
Churchill,
the end.
Then came in, although the Conservative Party did not want him. But he was the only conservative the Liberal Party and the Socialists would accept.
Right. And then when he came in, he made that famous speech.
Well, yes, he said, he looks down, and all of these men, they had mocked him, they had laughed at him, they had jeered, they'd walked out when he had given his warnings, and now, back against the wall, they're facing him. And he said, I speak to you for the first time since I became prime minister. And I will tell you, as I told the new cabinet last night, that the only thing I have to offer you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
And after that, not terribly long after that, came Dunkirk.
And the secretary, they were arguing with Churchill to negotiate a surrender because of this. They didn't know whether there would be an army left on the morrow. And the secretary is saying how Churchill went to the cabinet room, and he is lecturing, he's pacing back, and, as he said, it's kind of unintelligible, and then out the words would come out chiseled so perfectly like diamonds. And then he came to this voice, that we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the streets and in the hills. And then she said, Mr. Humes, his face broke into tears. His body shook with sobs for his stricken country for a whole minute. And then he said, we shall never surrender. And when he said that, the House of Commons the next day, they all rise up. And he says to the Foreign Secretary, if the Nazis do come ashore, we'll beat them over the heads with the butt ends of broken beer bottles, which is bloody all we've got. And he says that. And then he goes to the BBC studio and he says this. And this speech is beamed to Canada, Australia, but really it's beamed to one man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. And Roosevelt is up on the second floor with Harry Hopkins, his aide. And he turns it on, and when it's over and he hears that we shall fight, he says to Hopkins, well, Harry, as long as that old bastard's in charge, Britain will never surrender. It's not like putting money down the rat hole as in France. And a neutral nation gave aid to beleaguered Britain by hearing that speech.
Yeah. I don't want to break this, but I do want to mention one kind of interesting thing about an irony about that "we shall never surrender" speech. Because Churchill would never surrender, Lloyd George would never surrender, and Ho Chi Minh would never surrender. And you make the point in your book.
Interesting, yeah. In 1914, war is declared. And David Lloyd George is depressed because he's interested in domestic programs. And he thinks Churchill's a seaman, not a land creature. And suddenly, Churchill invites him for a dinner at the Savoy. And they're at the Savoy talking about this. But the waiter who's waiting on them is Ho Chi Minh. And it's interesting because Ho Chi Minh had been turned down for service in France because he was Asian.
Yeah.
And boy, he took that, and he bore that in here.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, Churchill, and they didn't know who Ho Chi Minh was, just a waiter with the dinner course.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's fascinating.
One of the little circumstances.
Yeah, history, yes.
Yeah, one of the little circumstances. To get back, after Dunkirk came Hitler's attempt to beat Britain into surrender, first by bombing the airfields and then by the Blitz.
Yes.
And Churchill made one of the great comments of human history about that after Britain won the Battle of Britain.
Yes, well, they light up the wall, and Churchill says here are these the blue buttons for the RAF fighter planes and the red buttons for the bombers, and finally the bombers die out, and Churchill said, they're turning tail, and he takes out an envelope and he writes an inscription. Never in the field of human conflict is so much been owed by so many to so few. And he was writing his inscription to the RAF, who were 18, 19, 20, who flew 40 hours in the sky.
Yeah.
And of course, when Churchill died, these RAF packed into their uniforms and rode in a V in the same hurricanes over St. Paul's.
20, these guys were then in their 40s.
Yes, 50 something.
People don't realize wars are fought by very young men, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old men. When did Roosevelt, FDR, send Churchill that quote from the Book of Ruth and also the
well,
part of the
he gave that to Harry Hopkins when Hopkins met Churchill, and Churchill would call Harry Hopkins Lord Root of the matter for getting down to the bottom of things. But he with him the letter, which he enclosed a poem by Longfellow.
This was before we were in the war.
Yes, this was in June 41. You know, sail on, O ship, and Churchill then, read it back. Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great, humanity with all its doubts and fears, and all its hopes for future years is hanging breathless at thy fate. What is the answer that I shall give America? Here it is. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job. And he gave that in a radio speech back because Wilkie had given him now the letter written out in Roosevelt's own hand with Longfellow's.
Yeah, which is some of the great lines about human history, about American history in the middle of the Civil War.
Yes.
Actually, it's about lines 270 to 275 of a very long poem about building a ship.
Yes, that's right. You're right.
And what were the quote from the Book of Ruth that FDR sent?
Whither thou goest, I shall go.
Yeah, and thy people shall be my people, and
yes.
Thy God shall be my God. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Churchill, within about 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, I think, the 21st and 22nd, something like that, of December 1941, came over here and made an address before Congress. What did he say about the Japanese and about the Americans and the British and
he spoke 3 weeks later to the podium when Roosevelt said, the day of infamy, but he says after he recites these litany of abuses and atrocities by the Japanese against the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy, he said, what kind of people do they think we are? That was, and boy, they all stood up, the American congressmen and senators, they stood up and applauded for about 10 minutes because he established, that was the most important speech he ever had to give. And this is why. He was afraid that the United States would concentrate in the war in Japan because, after all, we regarded the Pacific as our lake and not Germany. So that speech, he first was trying to show, look, I am with you. My parents, fought, and my ancestors were Americans. They fought in the Revolution. I am one of you.
And he said something about that,
too.
He
said, and if I can't help but reflect that if my father had been American and my mother English instead of the other way around. I might have got to this chamber on my own. And they all cheered, and he established that he was with them.
Yeah.
You know, a fellow politician, a fellow American in a sense.
Yeah.
But he didn't make the argument in that speech that he would make privately, which was, we got to have a priority on Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he wanted to set it up first.
Yeah. You know, there's another line in that that's great, which in that speech that was great, is something like, I don't have it exactly right, and I can't do the imitations like you can, but it's something like, what kind of people do they think we are? Do they not understand that we shall never cease until we have taught them and the world a lesson they shall never forget?
Do they not understand? You will teach them a lesson they and the world will never forget. Yeah. Thank you for that line. And that place just went wild.
Yeah. You know, I'm moved to say something, Jim. On your left breast pocket, your lapel pocket, you're wearing what is known as the OBE, the Order of the British Empire.
Well, when I do my Churchill things, it was given by the Queen, and because she said I was the only one on either side of the Atlantic who'd written biographies of the two greatest Englishmen, William Shakespeare and Winston Churchill. So there we are.
Yeah, and your imitations are not half bad.
Oh, well, thank you.
Now, after that, Churchill met Roosevelt in the middle of the Atlantic off Newfoundland, was it, where they established the...
Well, this was, he met him in June of 41, and of course he would come over here after Pearl Harbor in December 41. And they met, and they went up, and actually... Churchill forgot that he'd actually met Roosevelt before. Roosevelt was a bit miffed about that. But
I'll bet.
Yeah, because they had met in 1917. But he said, at last. And
excuse me, Roosevelt was himself Secretary of the Navy.
He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Yeah. And he met Churchill in the 4th of July luncheon. There were about 50 people there. But they go and they have this meeting. Churchill picks the phrase Atlantic Charter because it reflected Magna Carta to him. And the idea of a common principles was Roosevelt's, but Churchill wrote the words for the Atlantic Charter. And they meet and discuss that. The importance was symbolic, that America, even though it was neutral, they were with us. And you had the start of Lend-Lease. And that's a wonderful, and of course they have that joint service, Anglican service, and they sing, you know, onward, Christian soldiers, and here are the British Navy and the Royal Navy holding hands, and it's a moving thing.
Yeah.
And afterwards, the ship, the HMS Prince of Wales, goes back. And Churchill's up there in the helm, he's First Lord of the Admiralty. I don't know whether the captain liked it or not. And he sees, what's that over there? Because you see these dots on the screen. And he said, well, there are American Navy Merchant Marine ships. And they're about 40 miles away. He says, I want to go there. And I heard a Merchant Marine told me, he said, they saw at night, and the Churchill ship went cut through him not once but twice, and Churchill was on the prow like that.
Right.
Because he was saying thank you to these merchant marines who are braving their lives, getting arms. And I had one merchant marine tell me, so that made the whole trips worthwhile.
You know, I think it's a little known fact that I think our merchant marine suffered a higher percentage of casualties than anybody except perhaps the 15th Air Force and the Nazi submarine service.
Yes.
It's amazing because people think that, you know, this is something safe. No, this was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war.
They were braving submarines, yes.
Yeah. Now, Eisenhower and Churchill, well, first of all, Eisenhower came more into prominence as a result of some war maneuvers in 1940 and 41. Yes. First on the West Coast and then Louisiana. Why don't you tell us about that?
First of all, on the West Coast, the guy over him was, you know, a typical military bureaucrat, and they had one center, and they were trying to bring all the armies from Wisconsin over there to assemble for this mock, and they couldn't do it. And Eisenhower was, you know, going to cut the Gordian knot and say, hey, why not set 2 railroad centers? Oh, you can't do that. He went around them, and they did. That was the first thing. Then in Louisiana, Eisenhower was given more soldiers, but they were National Guardsmen, while the other group had the tanks. But his great hero was Grant. And Grant said, you can do something when you have numbers. Even though they didn't have the skill of the professional army, the other side did. And with the numbers, he beat them. And so they said, hey, this guy, and he went to the top. And Marshall, interesting, after they met, and when they came over, at the same time Churchill came over, the people met. Well, some of the British officers were a bit much, you know, saying, well, of course, you become a gentleman when you graduate from West Point, but we're gentlemen before we go to Sanders. and, you know, and the Americans just bristled. Yeah. But Eisenhower, you know, massive with this smile as wide as Kansas. Yeah. And didn't say anything, and afterwards Marshall says, Eisenhower, I've gone through the general officers list, and I've struck out everyone who's a desk pounder, blame shifter, doom monger, do it all yourself type, and you're the only one that's left. Don't let me down, Eisenhower.
Well, we're going to go to a break. When we come back, we will talk about Eisenhower being put in charge first in North Africa.
Yeah, and where the people felt he did let him down at first.
Yeah.
And Churchill came to his rescue.
And then finally, of course, Normandy. We'll discuss all that in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a public service announcement. Great. Welcome back. Jim, the first thing that happened once we really got into the war, the first thing that happened in Eisenhower's career of note was that he was put in charge of the landing of North Africa and then Sicily.
And he makes a deal with Darlan, head of the Vichy forces in France, and the American left and the newspapers just say, how does he make a deal with this anti-Semite, cryptic fascist? And Churchill comes to his rescue and says, well, if you can save one American or English life by making a deal with Darlan, Ike, kiss him on the cheek, Ike. Nay, kiss him on all four cheeks. and then, of course, the Americans have the first action at Kasserine Pass, and as Eisenhower said, I had my ass handed to me, and everyone said, bring Ike home, and Churchill says at 10 Downing, she said, well, first of all, it was a minor skirmish. Secondly, General Eisenhower succeeded in having the Nazis bring 4 divisions from Russia. And finally, he did the impossible. He welded together 2 nations seamlessly. Nay, 6 nations.
You know, that welding together, which was one of Eisenhower's great abilities. You mentioned to me a story about Eisenhower, about Churchill telling Eisenhower there's only one thing worse than fighting a war with the Allies. Why don't you tell that?
He said, well, there's only one thing worse than fighting a war with allies. And I said, what's that? Fighting a war without allies. And he said, what's the problem? He said, well, your General Patton is the only bull I know who carries his own China shop around with him. And then, of course, Eisenhower mentioned Montgomery. He said, oh, Monty, in defeat, indomitable, in victory, invincible, and he says in advance, invincible, and in victory, insufferable. And then he said, but the real cross is General de Gaulle. He says, he seems to think he's Joan of Arc, and my problem is that my bishops won't allow me to burn him.
Jim, Eisenhower and Churchill had some disagreements during the war. They remained extremely amicable, extremely close.
Yes.
They worked together beautifully, but they had a real disagreement about whether we ought to try and invade Europe through Italy and the Balkans or through France. Why don't you explain the thinking on each side about that?
Okay. Eisenhower always saw this as a general. Eisenhower saw it as a general and Churchill as a statesman. Churchill wanted to go through Italy and then to the Balkans to get there before the Soviets. Eisenhower said, you know, it's not the soft underbelly. These are mountains there, and he did not want to do that. So that was their first disagreement.
That was to sort of stop what happened with the Soviets taking over Eastern Europe.
Yes.
That was,
Yes, but you would lose a lot of people, and Eisenhower was thinking as a general. The second big difference was going into Berlin, and Eisenhower, like his hero Grant, Richmond and Berlin were not strategic centers. The idea was to destroy the army, and if Russia was going to go there. It would save 250,000 of our troops. And Eisenhower's feeling, well, look, if that's the case, let Churchill make his argument, because I agree, have reservations about the Soviets, to President Roosevelt, my commander-in-chief. So he was seeing it as a politician, and Eisenhower and Churchill as a statesman. I remember Harold Macmillan said, as an old man, he said in 1942, when we were losing the war, he says to me now, yeah, he said, what do you think of Cromwell? I said, well, what to say? He was rather aggressive, wasn't he? So, well, he said, Cromwell was obsessed with Spain. He said, Churchill, Cromwell was obsessed with Spain. He never saw the danger of France. And he said, even though we were losing at the war, Churchill at that time was already, after the war, what to do with the Soviet Union.
Well, I must say that the idea of fighting in Italy is approved. This is among the worst territory in the world, because it's up and down one mountain after another. Churchill did not agree really wholeheartedly, did he, with Eisenhower or the American generals in general about invading France through Normandy, or about the subsequent landing, which has been lost to history, at Marseille, which we made just a month or so after we landed in Normandy.
That's right. He was against that. Again, he thought tremendous losses would be taken, and he wanted to delay it. He said at one time, he said, if you, by the time snow flies, have taken control of the beachheads, I will say it's a magnificent operation. And if by the time of December you have taken Cherbourg, I will congratulate you on the greatest military operation in the 20th century. And if by the time snow flies in Christmas, the City of Lights perishes free, I will say you're the greatest commander since Julius Caesar, right?
They worked out a lot of this stuff, hashed a lot of this stuff out at regular luncheons and dinners, right?
Yes. They every Wednesday luncheon at 10 Downing Street, and then in the Friday at Chequers, and Churchill, as I said, Eisenhower called it his sunbath treatment.
And Churchill was actually, I don't know if instrumental is perhaps too strong a word, but Churchill always supported Eisenhower, even when Churchill's own General Montgomery, who was just a terrible guy in many ways.
He always supported Eisenhower, including Eisenhower was considering firing Montgomery, and Churchill agreed to back him, and then Eisenhower finally relented because he was such a icon. But he had, see, Eisenhower looked as a general. Churchill was a marvelous statesman. You know, they said about him that he was the only man in history who ever prophesied history, made history, and recorded history. And he had these gifts that you don't see anyone on the political stage having today. He had the ability to look into the future. He had the knowledge of an historian, Larry. He had the imagination of a poet. He had the courage of a soldier.
And he was a soldier.
And he was a soldier. He braved gunfire on 5 continents. That's why Eisenhower respected him so much. And he knew that he would make his prediction, and then on that prediction, another prediction, and on that, another. And most bureaucrats, they play it safe, and he was able to do that. And the courage of a soldier, because he was ready to face defeat if he's wrong. And Eisenhower said of Churchill, he said, you know, Winston always told audiences not what they wanted to hear, but what he wanted them to hear.
Which is something that
you don't hear today.
No, you don't hear that today at all. I think that Churchill once said something to the effect that after the Boer War, there is nothing so exhilarating as being fired at without effect.
Yes, he said that. No, he was at the American Field Force. There was nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result. And by the way, I helped write the toast for Reagan, for Margaret Thatcher, and I used that toast in it. And it was not picked up by the public. But when he was shot, he stripped for surgery. He says, well, you know what Churchill said, that nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result. And that went over national television.
Right. It wasn't the Boer War, it's the Malacan Field Force. Tell the audience a little bit about some of Churchill's famous predictions about the Cuban Revolution, when World War I would start, what would happen with
Russia. The most amazing thing was World War I. 3 years before it started, He said that Germany would invade France through Belgium. They would cut through, and for 40 days, the German advance, and then it would be stopped at the Marne River, and he was exactly right to the very day.
Now, how did he do that?
Well, I mean, he had this ability as a prophet of once, okay, they're going to do it this way because that's the way they have to, and then if they do that, then how many days would it take them to go through, and it's flat territory, and then you have the river. I mean, he just, as I said, had the courage of a soldier to not to play it safe, which bureaucrats do and politicians do, but to take that first, like a Columbus, and you're going out into uncharted waters, he would make that prediction and ride with it and take the next step and the next step.
You know,
and you know, I mean, he predicted, I mean, imagine in 1921, he said, if the West continues to rely on liquid fossil fuel from a fragile and politically vulnerable Middle East, someday we will be the victims of international extortion. We must have a new source, alternative source to oil. That was 1921.
Yeah.
I predicted the creation of Israel. 1905, he predicted, he sent messages to Stalin that Hitler was going to attack him. He predicted the Cold War. In fact, you know, the Iron Curtain, he predicted that. You know, he predicted to Jack Coleman, who's going to meet Eisenhower that first time and when Eisenhower was president, and Coleman said, well, when do you think the Iron Curtain will fall? And he said, well, he said, when you become my age, maybe 75, I'm 77, you will see it falling. Because he thought that World War II had given legitimacy to the Soviet revolution. But by the time their grandchildren were there, they would see the falsity of the Marxist promise and would fall. But, I mean, he was a genius. No one in history can match that.
Do you think that Eisenhower really wanted to become president, or did he do it out of a sense of duty, or was it both? Or how do you assess it?
Eisenhower was ambitious. He didn't show it, unlike Churchill. He figured Dewey would win in '48, and that was it. When Dewey didn't win, he had a problem. He saw Truman as a demagogic populist with deficit spending. He saw Taft as a dangerous isolationist. In the Taft election, he thought a Republican would win, and this would endanger all he had worked for in NATO, and he felt that he had to run.
Because Taft wasn't going to send soldiers over or anything like that.
Yes, he was going to really cut the commitment of NATO. He went to Taft and said, you know, please give me some commitments on NATO, and he wouldn't do it.
Yeah. Now, we have just 30 seconds left, but in that 30 seconds, maybe you can address the question. Eisenhower, when running for president, said he would go to Korea. He did go to Korea. Yes. Was that meaningful, or was that, to put it in harsh terms, sort of a political stunt to win the election?
Well, I mean, there was politics in it, but he knew that under the guidelines we accepted under Great Britain of not going past the Yalu River, that it was dangerous to stay there. He wanted to go over and confirm, see the battleground there, and see what could be done under the guidelines. But he felt that he went over there and wanted to buttress his own belief that we had to get out of there.
I see. So it was meaningful to him because he learned something. We have to wrap it up. Thank you very much. All the way from Colorado. Hey, terrific. Write another book, will you, so we can have you back again. Thanks a lot, Jim. And to our audience, thank you, and be with us again.